thought 4.5 hours was enough to properly delve deep into the heart of 80s horror, it's not. In Search of Darkness Part 2. It is the second installment of the In Search of Darkness documentary series. The first was highly acclaimed and was also crowdfunded, and it delved extremely deep into all the things that made the 80s such a definitive era in the history of the horror genre. And it included a wealth of great interviews from a veritable who's who in the horror industry. People such as Barbara Crampton, Jeffrey Combs, Stuart Gordon. It was a full-blown fangasm of horror goodness, and I have watched it like crazy over and over again. And you'd think a 4.5 hour documentary would get tedious after like the first couple of viewings, but it never does. I am infinitely addicted to it. It's just one of those things that as a horror fan, you can just jump right in and just eat it up and just love that all the people being interviewed are people who are just as enthusiastic about it as you, and because of that, the enthusiasm is infectious. So with the success of the first documentary, it actually surprised a lot of people that, oh, there was a second documentary coming out. Now, for those who remember me putting myself through unnecessary pain when I did the One Chip Challenge and also doing some of my recommendations on Shudder, I made mention that I actually put myself down as a backer for In Search of Darkness Part 2. And one of the perks of being a backer was that I was able to get early access to the documentary, and I figured, well, it entertained the hell out of me, so I wanted to get back and give you guys my review of In Search of Darkness Part 2. Now, the first thing that entered my brain when I heard about the second movie, especially after watching the first one, I was going, well, that first one was pretty damn long and got pretty deep into the heart of a lot of great aspects of not just 80s horror, but horror in general. So it led me to wonder what more could be said. Well, I can definitely tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that not only does Part 2 give you all the same wonderful things that we loved about the first one, it went beyond the sphere of what usually enters your head when you think about the 1980s. Now, when people think of 1980s horror, of course they go to the greats. They think of Jason Voorhees, they think of Freddy Krueger, they think of all those great icons that became icons because of this one period of the genre. But this one reminds you that no, there was a lot more going on with this genre outside the sphere of American cinema. Recently, I've really been jumping hard into Italian horror, especially with the works of Dario Argento, Lucio Fulci, and Mario Bava. There's a whole segment of this one that talks about the art of the giallo. And even better, there's some points where they even spotlight some of the best of those directors. With Fulci, they talk about City of the Living Dead, they talk about The Beyond. With Dario Argento, they talk about one of my favorites, they talk about Tenebrae, and they even talk about his second installment of the Three Mothers trilogy, Inferno. While I don't consider it superior to Suspiria, that was my third take saying that, by the way, I do think Inferno is definitely worthy of note in the annals of great Italian horror. This documentary does a great job showcasing why it is just as great as its predecessor. Because most of the people who talking about the movie are people who had nothing to do with the making of the movie. These are people who are talking about it from the audience perspective. There's actually people who have worked on other horror films who are aware of the craft of making one, who can look in on what they were doing in Italy and with these one-of-a-kind visionary filmmakers, and to see that their methods were completely different. They even talked about the cultural discrepancies in the way some filmmakers from different parts of the world make their stories versus the way we make them. And in fact, that's even talked about when they actually spotlight the movie Demons by Lamberto Bava. And actually one of the actresses, Garetta, who actually is one of the characters who kind of kickstarts the events in that story, she has so many wonderful things to say that I never really thought about when it came to the way stories progress. It's actually eye-opening. And it was in that instance when they started talking about the giallos that made me realize, oh no, there's so much more that they have not yet talked about. And one thing most people tend to forget about is that hundreds, sometimes even thousands of movies get made in 1 year alone, so much so that a lot of movies do get thrown by the wayside. But not only does this one showcase a lot of movies that were pretty much not only dismissed critically and commercially, but were ones that these people giving the interviews actually tell you Yeah, some of these aren't that great, but the thing is, they're still entertaining as hell, and they are telling you how they were able to enjoy them. Such as the movies of Jackie Kong, specifically Blood Diner and The Being, and they even talked about a vampire movie called Vamp with Grace Jones, which, how in my life have I missed out on a vampire movie starring Grace Jones? I thought that woman was a vampire already. And that's the beauty of this series, that so many movies that may have escaped your consciousness, you are now fully aware of, and now you want to take a leap and jump into some of them. And even better, when they talk about the ones you do know, you get this joy on your face because you're hearing about a lot of people talk about the movies that you enjoyed, and they're talking about with the same level of enthusiasm, and it makes you feel like I am not alone. There are other people who enjoy these crazy ass movies just as much as you do. In Search of Darkness does have a lot of returning icons to do continuing interviews, many of which you can blatantly tell was probably excess interview material that they probably did while making the first one, but they obviously couldn't fit it into the first one, which tells me that possibly the genesis of this documentary came about because they had a wealth of great material that they just couldn't do because they already had a 4.5 hour runtime, and any longer, and that might test people's patience. Guys, the Crystal Lake Memories documentary is near 6 to 7 hours, and we loved it. You're good. If this was a regular movie, we would call this lazy. In fact, one of the shortcomings of Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 2 is the fact that the first 40 minutes is just him recapping the first movie. When it comes to a documentary series, there's actually nothing wrong with that. That's just saying that there's so much good in one that they had to bleed over and just make another one, and you just got a lot more good with all these icons that you love. But it's not just rinse and repeat with all the people you see. They actually throw in a lot more into this one that weren't in the first one. You get interviews with people like Nancy Allen, you get Robert Englund, Linnea Quigley. They actually get a chance to showcase a lot of the movies Linnea Quigley was in, and even more so, one brilliant thing that this one does that the other one doesn't is that they actually have small little segments where the people in question actually get to talk about their careers. They have one for Nancy Allen, they have Linnea Quigley, they have Tom Savini gets a chance to really kind of reflect on his entire career as a makeup artist and an actor. And then you got Robert Englund, who was able to talk about his career beyond just Freddy Krueger. All of these segments are very intimate, and it was great hearing from these icons talking about some of the things that they had to learn to get comfortable with when they were making these movies. The one who actually was the most interesting of all was Linnea Quigley herself, because the one thing she was always known for was nudity. Every time I've ever seen her in a horror film, yeah, she's always showing skin. And I was always wondering to myself, how does one get comfortable with that? And the great thing about her is that she really did take the time to talk about how she really had to be comfortable with herself in order to be able to do a lot of things that filmmakers were demanding, whether the reasons were artistic or if they were just pure full-blown exploitation. And her career really did kind of run that gamut between films that were just low-grade trash to films that were very tongue-in-cheek. And she really did have a fascinating perspective on this very wide and expansive career. And such an icon was she that she even made her own personal horror-themed workout video. One of the great things about the first documentary was that it didn't just spend the time talking about movie after movie. There were times where it adjourned to talk about popular aspects of horror films, such as The Final Girl. We talked about why Christmas was such an oddly popular season to feature in horror films. They actually have a whole segment talking about children as they're portrayed in horror films. Now, one of the most notorious things that studios actually kept trying to put the kibosh on in a lot of other horror films is killing kids or putting kids in any sort of life-threatening peril. One of the reasons I've said in the past why I love Stranger Things is because it's a great throwback to the times when kids were actually in legit peril. Because I hate the notion that you're lying to kids telling them that because their kids are going to be okay. And in this documentary, they actually showcase a lot of great movies that feature kids and talk about how a lot of the movies in the 80s had kids in real life or death situations. And even in some cases, the kids don't make it out all right. And I'm pretty sure in the 90s, there was some blowback to that, which is why there was this really kind of vanilla period for kids in horror films where you pretty much were always certain the kids were going to survive. Because I remember there were a lot of movies that I saw when I was younger that actually shocked me and even kind of traumatized me, even if the movies weren't that good, but they freaked me out so bad that I didn't want to watch them again, because I remember seeing that the kids didn't make it out. A certain movie, which now I'm realizing may not have been as scary as I remember, was Terror Vision. And the main reason I remember it freaked me out bad was because the kid died in the end. And then there was other movies like the remake of The Blob, which same thing. While there was certain kids that survive it, there's one point where a kid gets pulled underwater by the blob and his body gets horribly mutilated. And I remember that had a kind of a profound effect on me. And yeah, you could call that trauma, but it's kind of the trauma I don't mind having, because yeah, you could say it kind of toughened me up, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. That you can still feel that sense of fear and danger, but you know that because you're watching a movie, you're in a safe space. And for a kid, has a pretty powerful effect. And the one great thing about horror in the 80s is that they had the audacity to be able to showcase some pretty crazy stuff happening to kids. And this documentary actually takes the time to talk about that. It, of course, talks about the phenomenon of comedy horror, which, while it's something that has actually happened going all the way back to the days of Abbott and Costello, comedy horror really started coming into its own around the 80s, because this was the time when Peter Jackson was coming to prominence, when Sam Raimi really brought the concept front and center, and even when a lot of other filmmakers were dabbling into it, of course, because Tobe Hooper with Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, among others. And now when you go back and watch a lot of these crazy movies, you come to the realization that a lot of them were funnier than they were actually scary. And that's not a bad thing to be. And it just showcased why horror is such a multifaceted genre, and it definitely deserves to be seen on different levels. It doesn't always have to be, dark and brooding and all that stuff. A lot of times you can laugh at it and have a great time laughing at it. But one thing they showcase in this documentary, which I did not think they were going to, and I love that they did, because it also got a chance to have some of the contributing YouTubers talk about it, is they actually took the time to talk about the horror video games that came out in the 80s. Now, of course, most people think of the Friday the 13th NES game or the Nightmare on Elm Street game, but no, we actually forget that there was a Texas Chainsaw game and a Halloween game on the days of the Atari 2600. And of course, they have that with some of the great YouTubers like James Rolfe. Of course, you can't talk about video games and not bring James Rolfe into the mix. And I will say this segment brought me a lot of nostalgia, because I did play some of these games, especially Friday the 13th. That was actually a personal favorite of mine. And they even took the time to showcase the making of the Friday the 13th game that Kane Hodder and Tom Savini had a hand in. So it was really cool to see how this period was so influential in horror video games that came afterwards, and even some of the controversies that came, especially during the 90s, with video games. So it's fun to think that horror really had such a profound effect, not just on movies, but on other mediums of entertainment. You have people like James A. Janice, from Dead Meat. You've got Cecil Trachtenberg from Good Bad Flicks. You got Brandon Tennell from Brandon's Cult Reviews. And you've got Oliver Harper, who even takes the time to focus on the video nasty controversy that was happening over in Britain at the time, which is something that definitely needs to be talked about, because that was a time when censorship was really going crazy, and how sometimes the problem with censorship is that it has the inverse effect. Like a lot of times when you ban a movie, it ends up creating a demand. But when I jumped into part 2, I immediately was blown away, because yeah, it just goes to show there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in our philosophy. Same thing goes with how much you think you know about horror. And In Search of Darkness Part 2 goes way beyond the reaches of what you think it is. Hell, so much so to the point that they even have a whole segment devoted to Tetsuo the Iron Man. And they even got the director to talk about it. In Search of Darkness Part 2 has not been released widespread yet, but I'm pretty sure in due course it's going to be released in all the streaming services. I'm betting dollars to donuts it's going to wind up on Shudder. So when the time comes, if you love the first one, and if you love horror as much as I do not hesitate. Jump on In Search of Darkness Part 2. Hell, take an entire day and just watch both of them back to back, because I guarantee it never gets old, never gets tedious. I love watching all these people who have made a career in this genre, who still have love and reverence and appreciation for everything they've done to it to this very day. It is probably one of the most influential genres in cinema, principally because a lot of great filmmakers started with horror, and as they've evolved, they've ended up creating new and inventive ways to showcase, ways to scare people, because let's face it, the purpose of a great film is to engage with the viewer and invoke some kind of emotion out of them. The two hardest emotions to bring out of people is pure laughter and pure fear. And this documentary does an exemplary job of showcasing how that genre has traveled so many different avenues in order to find new ways of scaring the ever-loving shit out of you. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that this is just a long-winded pat on the back devoted to a genre that has capitalized on human suffrage? I have nothing to say that can possibly change your mind on that subject, so why are you even watching this channel? Or do you think that this is the ultimate gestalt of fans and creators saluting a genre that has had an incredible effect on cinema as a whole? Leave it all in the comments below, and for more addictive content and narcotic casserole, simply like, share, subscribe, click. Thou shalt be served. While I don't consider that while I don't consider it superior to Suspiria, that was my third take saying that, by the way.